Hi, and thanks for joining me. Stephen Barry spent 12 years as personal manservant to the then Prince Charles, and soon after Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer, some tension entered into their relationship and Stephen Barry resigned. He retired from his position as valet to the then Prince Charles. He then went on to become an author, his first book being Royal Service. Now that really could have been an authorised memoir because it wasn't really too bad. There was nothing very salacious, nothing very gossipy. It was interesting to read for sure, but there was nothing really juicy, one might say, until he went on to write this book, Royal Secrets, that I have really enjoyed reading, and I want to share some highlights from you. Now, if you enjoy this video, I'm happy to keep going with this and share more and more and more and more, or it might be a one-off. It depends on the reaction and whether you enjoy it or not. Now, Stephen Barry actually tragically died in 1986, and this book was actually published in 1985, and he died of AIDS at the age of 37. So that is indeed tragic. Now, it's reported that he made about $1 million, or it could have been £1 million. I'm not quite sure. You never can tell whether people are talking pounds or dollars, but he made a lot of money, let's put it that way, from both these books. So I'm hoping that his last moments were sort of spent in some sort of comfort, that he managed to enjoy some of the proceeds from his books. Now, if you're a lover of the royal family, you will love this book because it is very affectionate. It is an affectionate romp through both sides of the green baize door. The green baize door, of course, being that door that divides the servant or the staff of the royal household and the family themselves. Now, Stephen Barry kicks off this book with a chapter titled All the Queen's Men, and in it he outlines all the different roles within the royal household. And he makes a really interesting point on the first page that the moment that a royal is born, they are literally surrounded by staff. Even one could go as far as to say that a lot of royal children are brought up by them. So they play a very, very important role in their lives. He also observes that on the summer holidays in Balmoral, often it would be the case that over 120 staff would be waiting on only 6 members of the royal family. But then he would point out that Balmoral was used to entertain a lot during those summer holidays. And when there was a full house, when all the people that had been invited to join the Queen at Balmoral actually arrived, those 120 staff would be run off their feet. Now, he makes a really interesting point that the late Queen owned Balmoral and Sandringham and the houses and surrounding farms, but she doesn't own Windsor or Buckingham Palace. And whenever they were in residence at Buckingham Palace, the Duke of Edinburgh used to say that they lived above the shop. Now, that's a very sort of glamorous way to live above the shop, isn't it? But he goes on to tell a story that really always used to be thrown at the then Prince Charles, that his personal manservant used to put toothpaste on Prince Charles' toothbrush for him. And many people were really damning and sarcastic about that. And then the excuse was given, well, that was because Prince Charles fell off his polo pony and broke his arm. You'll remember that in actually Wendy Berry's book. Well, that story originated with the Duke of Edinburgh because it actually was in this book. So it's funny, isn't it, that with Chinese whispers and rumours and salacious gossip, that things get passed down over the years. But in this book, I found the origin of that story, and I'll read you out that little bit. Barry Lovell, who was personal manservant to the Duke of Edinburgh, had a task that he performed every night. He placed the toothpaste on the royal toothbrush, Prince Philip's royal toothbrush, before His Royal Highness cleaned his teeth before bed. So that was the source of that story. Isn't that funny? But he goes on to say that the amount of that servants did for the royal family, particularly in the older days. For example, the Duke of Gloucester, who died in 1974, who was the Queen's cousin, was actually sitting in his home, Barnwell Manor. He was reading the paper and he was sitting in front of a blazing log fire, whereupon a log actually rolled out of the fireplace and started sort of smoking and singeing the rug that was in front of the fire. Well, the Duke of Gloucester didn't move a muscle. He just sat there, he kept reading the paper until eventually a footman was passing past the drawing room door and he saw all this smoke billowing out under the crack in the door, whereupon he rushed in because he was, frightened that the Duke of Gloucester was, in a serious fire sort of situation. And the Duke just looked up and said, "Oh, about time," as the footman picked up the log with tongs and replaced it into the fireplace. Now, Stephen Barry also played another function besides valet. He was also a page to the then Prince Charles. Now, Prince Charles wasn't grand enough in the scheme of things to warrant his own page, not when the Duke of Edinburgh and the late Queen were alive. But Stephen Barry performed that function for him. And pages often were really the gatekeepers to stop people getting access to their principals. And I'll read you that little snippet. "I was the one who told the lies, made the excuses, saying that he was otherwise engaged, or simply, 'I can't find him anywhere.'" Anyone other than the family had to actually make an appointment to see the then prince. However, there were two people that were exceptions to that rule, and guess who they were? I'll just take a moment, give you a chance to guess. Lady Susan Hussey. Yes, Lady Susan Hussey was later thrown under the bus with that racism uproar with Queen Camilla at that royal function when Prince William was off to the Earthshot Prize in Boston, and Ngozi Fulani actually raised her many complaints about Lady Susan Hussey's alleged treatment of her, racist treatment of her. Well, Lady Susan Hussey could walk in and see the then Prince Charles whenever she wanted to. And the other woman that could was Mabel Anderson, his nanny. She could also go in, and she was the only one that was actually allowed to call him Charles. There's an interesting, fun little story. One day, Lady Susan Hussey was having tea with the prince when squadron leader David Checkett's private secretary to the prince buzzed me from his office downstairs to ask if the prince was around. "I'm sorry," I said, "he's engaged at the moment with Lady Susan." Whereupon the squadron leader made his way up the stairs, thinking, well, by the time I get there, he'll be finished with Lady Susan Hussey and I'll be able to see him. Well, when he got there, he found out that the prince was still engaged, this time with Mabel Anderson, and she had actually followed in on the heels of Lady Susan when she left. And the squadron leader was rather, frustrated by this, and he said, "Why is my life constantly instructed by ladies-in-waiting and bloody nannies?" he bawled. Now, the prince actually complained about his private secretary to great uncle Dicky, Lord Mountbatten, saying that the regimen was too oppressive. Now, it's interesting that David Checketts was actually appointed private secretary to the then Prince Charles by his father, the Duke of Edinburgh. And he was very, very much old school squadron leader. And he was actually the one that supervised the then Prince Charles when he came out to Australia to actually attend Geelong Grammar, Timbertop, which is sort of like the bush school part of Geelong Grammar. And he accompanied the prince, and he really didn't sound very fun. He sounded very officious, very much a squadron leader, and very much someone that Prince Philip relied on to keep Charles in line. Well, Charles wasn't having any of it once he got a little bit older, complained bitterly, and his uncle Dicky Mountbatten advised him to, well, get rid of him then, but for heaven's sake, give him a gong on his way out. So that's exactly what happened. To keep him actually happy, he became Sir David Checketts, and all was settled quite amicably. Now, the side benefit or side downside of having staff surrounding the late Queen constantly was that Stephen Barry says there was always someone going up to her and telling her something, telling her some little bit of gossip from downstairs, some little tidbit about a member of staff. Often backgrounding went on against staff member, and they always went up to the Queen, and she would always try to sort it out or wanted to have her ear on the ground. She wanted to make sure that she was on top of everything and nothing got too far out of control. So you could say that the late Queen was very well briefed. But he does make the point that the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen Mother would not entertain any gossip at all from their servants. But he did say that they tended to get out in the world more than the late Queen, that she was very restricted and very sort of bowed down and her time taken up by duty, day in, day out. So I guess a lot of the fun she would have would be these little juicy bits of tidbits of information that she would get from her staff members. And he goes on to describe it this way. We had a palace joke that the only time Her Majesty was free of gossip when she took her corgis for a walk. The rest of the time, someone or other of the staff would be feeding her bits of information about what was going on in the palace. He also says that all the staff that had worked there for quite a while were aware that when the Queen was feeling rather unhappy and when she was going to lose her temper. Now, it didn't happen often. She was always lovely. I mean, obviously they felt prepared to go up and tell her these little tidbits. And she was also renowned for saying hello to staff members and using their name and making them feel important. However, she could lose her temper because she was a human being like the rest of us, and they could tell the signs, and these are the signs. When she's building into a highly controlled rage, it was highly controlled, the Queen twists her wedding ring on her finger and her mouth begins to move as if she's going to say something extremely positive. But she wasn't. And he tells the story when President Reagan was actually staying there at Windsor and they were going off to have a ride together. You know, you've seen all those famous photographs of President Reagan and the Queen. And the Queen was riding Burmese and they sort of fronted up to the press. Now, the Queen would just say hello and keep riding. She wouldn't entertain the press, wouldn't perform for the press. That just wasn't what she did. However, President Reagan, being the politician that he was and being the ex-movie star that he was, started playing to the press gallery a little too much. I mean, they were enthralled, he was enjoying the attention and he was playing up the moment. He had all his cowboy gear on, he was looking rather dashing. And the Queen started twisting her wedding ring and her mouth started moving in a rather sort of positive way. And all the staff were watching this unfold and were thinking, she's furious. She's absolutely furious because by playing up to the press, she felt like she was being used a little bit as a bit of a political puppet. And so she didn't like it. So she gathered the reins of Burmese and she galloped off. And she smoothed it over later at a reception with the president later on. She said that Burmese was getting restless and she felt it was better that she just let him ride away. Now, Stephen Barry, when he first started at the palace, was also nursery footman, and it was his task to look after Prince Andrew. This is a little passage. One of my duties was to try and keep Prince Andrew amused. It was a formidable task, as he was a boisterous, active child who never seemed to settle for a moment. He had the habit of pulling the footmen's tails, which often got him a slap when no one was looking. I've often wondered how much, when the children were little, whether the staff took it upon themselves to give them a slap or a tweak of the ear or a kick up the backside and nobody ever knew. I mean, I guess they would have been. I remember I saw an interview with Princess Anne and she didn't throw anyone under the bus. She was very circumspect. She was very careful. But she implied that she didn't necessarily get as favourable treatment from the staff as the then Prince Charles because, of course, you know, he was the heir. And I picked up that often she wasn't treated very well. In her very understated way, she did really intimate that she did not get treated very well at times. So she was quite happy when she went away to school. There's a funny story about one of the Queen's footmen, Basil Stibbs. Isn't that a fantastic name? Don't you think that's just classic, Basil Stibbs? And he was actually one of the Queen's favourite footmen because the corgis loved him, absolutely adored him. The corgis adored him whenever he entered Her Majesty's presence. The dogs would leave her feet and cluster around him, yapping with delight. "You're so good with the dogs, Basil," the Queen would say. "Yes, Your Majesty. I'm very fond of them," Basil would reply modestly. Now, Stephen Barry didn't believe it for a second. He said, "Come on, Basil, what is it? What's your secret?" At first he protested that there wasn't a secret, but then he actually fished in the pocket deep in the tail of his dress coat and produced a lamb chop. I always keep one in there," he said in a confidential whisper. "Works a treat, doesn't it?" There's another story about a footman determined to get the Beatles' autographs because, of course, they went to the palace to receive their Member of the British Empire honour, and he pinched a bit of royal letterhead, a piece of paper with the royal letterhead on it. And after they'd received their honour and they were actually leaving, the footman ran up to them and said, "Oh, Princess Anne's up in the nursery and she can't come down right now, but she sent me to get all of your autographs." And all the Beatles, every member of them, signed the piece of paper and the footman ran off with it. And can you imagine what he sold that for? Now, Stephen goes into a bit of detail about what his duties entailed. He would put out his master's clothes ready in the morning after having drawn the curtains and run the bath. Then he would discreetly leave until called for again. He had to make sure that all the uniforms were, right, and he had to keep a close eye on the working schedule to ensure that the right clothes for every occasion were clean, pressed, mended, and ready to go. He also took care of laundry and dry cleaning, but he would wash the then Prince Charles's handkerchiefs himself, as otherwise they were always stolen for souvenirs. Now, a new master of the household, Brigadier Hardy Roberts in 1969, wanted to go about making some changes at the palace. They wanted to look after the staff some more, and as it was known as the Pink Mafia, because there were just so many gay people that worked at the palace, they were trying to sort of make it a little more manly. So they got together and got these staff meetings happen where they tried to make their life a little more balanced, a little well-rounded. And one footman requested that there be a hobbies room for the staff, and he asked if he could keep a lathe in his room. Now, the Duke of Edinburgh was, trying to make this all a bit more manly at the palace, so of course it was approved, and the master of the household said yes, he could. Now, listen to this. I couldn't believe this. I'm going to read it verbatim because it is such an explosive story. Literally. Unfortunately, this particular footman had a passion for explosives. With another palace employee, he'd been robbing mines all over the country for sticks of gelignite. I kid you not. I kid you not. And they used a stolen vehicle to get these sticks of gelignite. But guess how he made his false number plate for his stolen vehicle? On the lathe in his room. But they made the mistake of parking the Land Rover, the stolen Land Rover with the false plates that he made with the lathe in his room. They actually parked it in the forecourt at Buckingham Palace, and the police descended. It turned out that they were bizarrely interested in explosives and mining and had a lot of that sort of said material in their rooms, but it was found that they were not part of the IRA, not part of a terrorist organisation of the time, but they did go to jail. Now, there was a staff canteen, which from 10 o'clock in the morning you could booze. You could go in and ask for any sort of drink that you like. But he says that the Queen and her family were basically non-drinkers, unlike the Queen Mum. The Queen used to have her usual tipple as Melvin water. Prince Philip might have a beer, he said, so he wasn't really keen on drinking. I know that the then Prince Philip, around the time of the coronation for Queen Elizabeth II, actually had a really bad case of jaundice and actually had liver damage. Now, that could have been from him and sort of drinking a little too much. He used to in his youth, so maybe he knew he had to be careful from that point. And I've heard in a lot of books that he would only have the occasional beer, around this point in time. Princess Anne drank gallons of Coca-Cola, yet she stayed so slim. Amazing. And Prince Charles and Princess Diana lived on lemon refreshers, a homemade lemon drink. So they weren't really up to the boozing, but all the staff did. Oh, all the staff did, from the top of the household to the lowliest of the low. They used to hit the staff canteen and enjoy a tipple or three. And often equerries would be found having a meeting in the staff bar. So, it sounds like a pretty great place to work for, really, doesn't it? He tells a funny story about the consequences of that staff canteen. There were a couple of royal footmen that actually were on leave for the weekend, and they were travelling home to Kent on a train. Now, unfortunately for them, in the carriage was a fervent royal monarchist lady, and she took great objection because the royal footmen were actually sticking the boot in to each member of the royal family. They were sort of going through each member and canning them and having a lovely time just bitching about each one of them on the train. And she wrote a letter to the palace and reported on them and said everything that they said. And from that letter, the two footmen were actually identified and they were summarily dismissed. Now, they were sacked because I think they were nasty and mean, but often when staff were drunk, they wouldn't get sacked, even after 3 warnings. One footman at an important state occasion was actually using the tray he was holding to hold himself upright, and he just reeked of beer. Now, beer was not being served at this state occasion, so when he reeked of beer, they knew it was coming from the actual footman, and he was sort of swaying a bit near the door and holding this big heavy tray, and sure enough, boom, he went over. And like I said, he'd had 3 warnings previously, but the Queen just overlooked it. She sort of sympathised, I think, with people that like to have a tipple or two. But when it came to being nasty and saying mean things on the train, you were out of there. Now, there's some poignant things just to finish off this first chapter where he said that they used to love playing table tennis when he was nursery footman on this really big wooden table that they would clear, long scrubbed table in the staff quarters. And they used to set up a net and play table tennis. And often Prince Andrew would actually appear on the other side of the green baize door and actually ask to play. And he said, of course, that then Lady Diana Spencer, prior to her marriage, when she was actually staying, would also appear in staff quarters and want to interact and chat and be with the staff. So he said he could really sense a lot of the time their loneliness, their disconnect from each other in the family, and he had some sympathy for that. Now, to finish off this chapter, he says a really interesting thing because he talks about Queen Elizabeth II ascending to the throne and how the fact that when a new monarch actually ascends to the throne, all the old staff for the previous monarch is given 6 months' notice, whereupon the new monarch has the option to re-employ them. But if they don't, they're gone. And a lot of the old retainers, people that have been with them for years and years, would of course be given grace and favour, homes on the estate and things like that. But he says an interesting thing, because of course when he wrote this book in 85, Queen Elizabeth II was Queen. He said, when the Queen and Prince Philip came to Buckingham Palace with their 2 small children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, they kept most of the King's employees, but the old staff bitterly resented the new arrivals from Clarence House. Bennett and another page, Bill Holloway, had to fight their way through this barrier of loyalty. No doubt, hopefully in the far distant future, when Prince Charles becomes king, the same thing will happen all over again. And indeed, it did. And I guess it will happen again when Prince William becomes king as well. So let me know down below if you really enjoyed these tales from this book, Royal Secrets, The View from Downstairs. It's an out-of-print vintage book. You won't really be able to get it very easily. I've been looking for this for quite a while. I eventually found it on eBay, I think. Like every book I always do, the price is going to go through the roof. So if you're interested in following along a little bit more with this book with me, well, grab it now before the price goes up. I actually paid a fair bit for this one too. I had to actually get it over from the USA. So let me know down below if you want me to tell a few more tales from this book. I'm not necessarily going to go through it chapter by chapter. I'll pick out the really interesting bits. But let me know. I'll know if you're not interested. I'll be able to tell. Anyway, I'll be back really soon with another video for you. Bye.